The highway was calm that evening. The sun had just set, leaving the sky painted in soft shades of orange and purple. Cars moved steadily, most drivers eager to reach home after a long day. Among them was an elderly black man. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his eyes focused on the road ahead. He had just left his daughter's house after dinner and was making his way back to his own home. The drive was peaceful, the kind of quiet ride that allowed him to think about life, his family, and the work he had dedicated decades to. The man was well-dressed, wearing a neatly pressed suit. His silver hair glowed faintly in the dim light of the car. The vehicle he drove was a sleek, dark sedan, classy but not overly flashy. It matched his personality, elegant, calm, and dignified. For him, driving at night was a chance to enjoy solitude, yet as he looked in the rearview mirror, he noticed flashing red and blue lights approaching fast. A sinking feeling came over him. He pulled over immediately, signaling as he did, because he believed in following the law, even in the smallest details. The police car stopped behind him. The bright headlights reflected off his mirror, momentarily blinding him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had lived long enough to know that these moments could quickly turn from routine to tense. Slowly, he lowered his window, resting both hands on the wheel where they could be seen clearly. He had taught many young people that respect and patience were often the best tools to handle confrontation. Now, he reminded himself of his own lesson. The officer stepped out of the patrol car. His movements were sharp, almost theatrical, as if he wanted to make his presence known. He walked with quick steps toward the elderly man's car. His hand brushed against the holster at his side, though there was no threat before him. When he arrived at the window, he didn't greet the man politely. Instead, his voice was loud, almost accusing. "License and registration," the officer said, without offering any explanation for the stop. The elderly man nodded calmly. "Of course, officer. May I ask what the issue is?" His tone was polite, steady, not confrontational. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Just do as I say. People like you shouldn't be driving cars like this." "Must be stolen, huh?" The words cut through the night. The elderly man felt a sting of humiliation, though he showed no anger. His face remained composed, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached for his wallet, making sure the officer could see every action he took. He had practiced this kind of calm for years, in courts and public places, in moments where emotions ran high. Tonight, he relied on that same discipline. He handed over his license and registration with a steady hand. The officer snatched them, giving only a quick glance before shaking his head. "This address," the officer muttered, reading the man's home location aloud. "Pretty fancy neighborhood. Don't think you belong there." The elderly man looked out at the horizon, the sky now darker, the stars faintly appearing. He did not answer, because sometimes silence carried more power than words. Around them, a few cars slowed down, drivers curious about the stop. A couple of them parked a little farther down the road, pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The officer leaned closer to the window. His tone carried irritation, almost as if the man's calmness was an insult. "You think staying quiet makes you smarter? I've seen this before. Elderly or not, you don't get special treatment here. Step out of the car." The elderly man hesitated for only a second before opening his door slowly. He stepped out, his posture tall and steady despite his age. His polished shoes touched the pavement as he stood under the harsh beam of the patrol car's lights. The scene looked uneven, one man using authority with aggression, and the other relying only on dignity. As he stood there, the officer began circling the car, peering into the windows as though expecting to find something suspicious. The man watched quietly, his face expressionless. Deep inside, he felt the sharpness of disrespect, but he reminded himself of the bigger picture. He had faced challenges far greater than this. Years of service in the highest legal seat of the nation had taught him that injustice often revealed itself in small, everyday acts. Tonight was one of those times. The officer returned, his hand resting near his belt again. "Tell me, old man, how exactly did you get this car? Must have cost quite a fortune. No way someone like you bought it honestly." The crowd watching grew. A young woman whispered to her friend, "He looks so calm. Why is that cop treating him like that?" Their phones stayed up, recording every moment. A group of teenagers nearby frowned, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. The elderly man finally spoke, his voice steady, measured. "I worked hard my entire life, officer. I paid for this car the same way any honest man would, the officer scoffed. Yeah, right. We'll see about that. He pulled out his radio, muttering something about backup. The elderly man stood still, his mind wandering for a brief moment. He remembered the countless times he had stood in court, defending the rights of people who faced unfair treatment. He remembered the speeches he had given about justice, equality, and dignity. Now here he was, living through the very thing he had spoken about so many times. As the minutes passed, the air grew heavier. The flashing lights illuminated the dark road, painting the scene in red and blue. The officer paced, still throwing sharp looks at the man. But the elderly man never broke his calm. His presence, though quiet, carried a strength that didn't need to be loud. Inside, he knew something the officer did not. He carried a truth that would change the course of this night. He wasn't just any elderly driver. He wasn't a man struggling to prove himself. He was one of the highest judges in the land, a Supreme Court judge, entrusted with the responsibility of upholding the Constitution. But he didn't reveal that yet. He chose patience, because sometimes the lesson was greater when revealed at the right moment. As the sound of another siren echoed in the distance, signaling the arrival of backup, the elderly man took another deep breath. The night was far from over, and he knew this encounter was about to reach a turning point. The flashing lights of the patrol car still colored the night sky, casting a red and blue glow on the empty stretch of highway. The elderly man stood quietly beside his car, his posture straight, his hands resting calmly in front of him. His silver hair glistened under the harsh beams, and though he appeared fragile because of his age, there was a silent dignity in his stance. The officer, however, did not see dignity. He saw only someone he had already judged in his mind. "Turn around," the officer barked. "Put your hands on the hood of the car." The elderly man looked at him, his expression controlled, his breathing steady. He had faced countless confrontations in courtrooms filled with tension, but rarely had he felt the sting of such casual disrespect. Still, without complaint, he turned and placed his palms on the smooth surface of the car. The metal was cold beneath his touch. The officer began questioning him again, his voice sharp, designed to humiliate. "Where exactly were you tonight? Don't lie to me. I know you weren't where you're saying." The elderly man answered softly. "I was at my daughter's home. We had dinner together and I was driving back." His voice carried no anger, no resistance, only calm honesty, but the officer shook his head with a sneer. "Sure you were? People like you always have excuses. You think because you're dressed nice and driving a fancy car you can fool me?" He stepped closer, shining his flashlight directly into the man's face. The brightness made the elderly man blink, but he did not move. He let the silence speak louder than any argument he could have made. His years of wisdom told him that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. Yet even in that silence, humiliation burned within him. To be treated this way after all he had achieved was painful. The officer pulled the car door open without permission and leaned inside. He checked the glove compartment, the seats, even the back floor, as though expecting to uncover something illegal. His movements were quick and careless, showing no respect for the man's belongings. A book slid from the passenger seat and landed on the ground, a thick volume of legal notes. The elderly man bent slightly, picking it up with careful hands. His eyes rested on the book for a moment, remembering how many hours he had spent studying law, building arguments and writing judgments that would shape the lives of millions. But here none of that mattered. At least not yet. The officer slammed the door shut. "You know what I think?" he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "I think this car isn't yours. I think you're lying. And until I prove it, you're not going anywhere." The elderly man exhaled slowly. He did not argue, though he had every reason to. Instead, he chose to maintain the calm exterior that had carried him through decades of pressure-filled moments. He had once said to a young lawyer, "Respect is not about how others treat you. It's about how you carry yourself when they do not." Tonight, those words returned to him, not as advice for another, but as a reminder for himself. Meanwhile, a small crowd had gathered across the road. Drivers who had stopped were still recording the scene with their phones. Their voices were whispers carried by the night breeze. "Why is he treating that old man like that?" one person said. Another added, "He looks so gentle and that cop is just barking orders. It doesn't feel right." The officer heard the murmurs but ignored them. His pride would not let him back down. Instead, he doubled down on his accusations. "Tell me again, how can you afford this car? Men like you don't live in neighborhoods like the one on your license." The elderly man turned slightly, meeting the officer's eyes. His voice was low but firm. "I have worked for many decades. I have given my life to service and to justice. That is how I live where I live. That is how I afford what I own." The officer smirked. "Justice? Don't make me laugh. You think throwing around big words is going to save you?" By now, the backup the officer had called for was pulling up. Another patrol car parked behind the first, its lights flashing, adding to the chaos of color and noise on the quiet road. Two younger officers stepped out. They approached with slower steps, their expressions uncertain as they took in the scene. The elderly man noticed their hesitation. They seemed to sense that something about this stop wasn't ordinary. Still, the first officer pressed on, raising his voice even louder, as though to prove his authority not just to the man but also to the watching crowd. "You think you're better than me, huh? You think wearing a suit and driving a car like this makes you above the law?" The elderly man replied quietly, "No one is above the law. That is the foundation of our nation." Those words made the officer scoff again, but they carried a weight that the onlookers felt deeply. The way the old man spoke was not like someone afraid or defensive. It was the voice of someone who had lived his entire life believing in fairness, in dignity, in equality. Even without knowing his true identity, the crowd could sense there was something unusual about him. The officer ordered him again to stay put, pacing back and forth, muttering insults under his breath. The humiliation continued, stretching the minutes into what felt like hours. For the elderly man, each insult was another reminder of the gap that still existed in society, the gap between what justice should be and what it sometimes was in practice. The backup officers glanced at each other. One of them studied the man more carefully. His face seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. He noticed the book in the man's hand, the polished shoes, the deliberate calmness in his posture. It wasn't the kind of calm that came from resignation. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly who he was and didn't need to prove it. The officer in charge didn't notice. He was too busy feeding his own pride, enjoying the feeling of control. But the humiliation he forced on the man was becoming harder to justify with each passing second. The witnesses were restless. Phones captured every word, every gesture. It was all being documented in real time. The elderly man knew this too. He understood that history often turned on moments like these. Not planned, not staged, but real, raw, and filled with truth. He had no desire to shame anyone, but he also knew that the truth had a way of rising when the time was right. The night grew colder, and still the stop dragged on. The officer kept pressing, kept accusing, but the old man stood steady. Inside, he carried both patience and quiet sadness. He thought of his daughter, who would soon wonder why he hadn't arrived home yet. He thought of his grandchildren who looked up to him as an example of honor. And he thought of the countless people across the country who faced moments like this every day, without the shield of authority he secretly held. He was humiliated, yes, but not broken. Because he knew something no one else on that highway yet understood. His identity, his true position, would soon change everything. The sound of more sirens echoed faintly in the distance. The scene was about to shift again, and the man, though calm, could feel the turning point approaching. The night air grew heavier as more sirens echoed in the distance. The elderly man stood quietly beside his car, his calm face lit by the red and blue flashes of the patrol cars. The first officer still paced like a man eager to prove his authority, barking out unnecessary orders, while the crowd on the opposite side of the road grew larger. People had pulled over to see what was happening, their phone cameras capturing every detail. What had started as a simple traffic stop had turned into a public scene, and the tension was almost unbearable. The two younger officers who had arrived earlier seemed uneasy. They had seen stops before, but this one felt different. Something about the elderly man was unusual. He didn't react the way most people did when confronted with hostility. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't tremble. His silence was not fear, it was dignity. It unsettled them. One of the younger officers leaned toward the other and whispered, "Do you recognize him? He looks familiar." The other frowned, studying the man closely. The silver hair, the sharp eyes that revealed wisdom, the way he held himself with a calm strength. It sparked a memory. Then, as the man adjusted the thick legal book in his hand, the younger officer suddenly understood. His eyes widened. "That's him," he murmured. "I've seen him on television. That's Judge, the Supreme Court Justice." His voice dropped to a near whisper, but the words carried weight. The second officer looked again, his heart pounding. Yes, it was him. The man standing there under the harsh lights being humiliated in front of strangers was no ordinary citizen. He was one of the highest legal minds in the country, a man who had shaped decisions that affected millions. He was a Supreme Court judge. The realization made both young officers step back for a moment. Their respect deepened instantly, but they didn't speak up yet. The lead officer, still unaware, continued his loud accusations. "You think keeping quiet makes you innocent? I know your type. Always trying to slip through with lies. Tell me the truth, old man. Did you steal this car?" The elderly man slowly lifted his head and met the officer's eyes. His expression was calm, but there was a firmness in his voice now. "I told you the truth already. I own this car, and more importantly, I have spent my life upholding the law that you claim to protect." The officer chuckled mockingly. "Upholding the law? Don't flatter yourself. You're just another liar on the road." The younger officers exchanged uneasy looks. One of them cleared his throat, stepping forward slightly. "Sir, maybe we should double-check his license and run the registration again," he suggested, trying to steer the situation in a safer direction. But the first officer waved him off. "I don't need advice. I know what I'm doing. This one's not fooling me." The elderly man stood silently once more, though deep inside he felt a mix of sadness and patience. He had seen arrogance before, in lawyers, in politicians, even in powerful corporations who thought they were untouchable. But this was different. This was a street encounter, stripped of the robes, titles, and formal respect he usually commanded. Here he was simply an old man, being treated as though his life's work meant nothing. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. People began to sense something was off. "Why is that cop going so far?" one person whispered. "The old man looks too composed. It's almost like he knows something." Another person, scrolling quickly through their phone, whispered to a friend, "Wait, I think I know who he is. Doesn't he look like the judge from the Supreme Court? I saw him in the news last year," the whispers spread. Some of the bystanders began to recognize him too, and their voices carried across the road. The officer didn't pay attention at first, but the younger officers did. They grew more nervous with each passing moment. They could feel the truth about to surface, and with it, a wave of consequences for their colleagues' behavior. Finally, the elderly man decided to speak more firmly. His voice was low, but it carried authority that demanded attention. "Officer," he said slowly, "you have asked your questions and I have answered with respect. But I want you to understand something. I am not a man who lies. I am not a man who takes what is not his. My life's work has been to defend justice, fairness, and the Constitution of this nation." The officer rolled his eyes. "Spare me the speeches. You sound like some kind of lawyer." The elderly man's calm gaze didn't waver. "Not a lawyer," he said softly. "Something more." That statement caught the attention of everyone present. The officer frowned, trying to make sense of it. The bystanders leaned forward, holding their phones higher, recording every word. The younger officers looked at each other, their expressions confirming the truth they already knew. The first officer grew impatient. "Stop playing games. Who exactly do you think you are?" he demanded. The elderly man let the silence linger for a moment, the weight of his words building. Then in the same calm tone he said, "I am a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States." The words dropped like a stone in still water, rippling through the entire crowd. Gasps erupted. Some bystanders lowered their phones for a moment, stunned by the revelation. Others whispered excitedly, "I knew it. That's him. Oh my goodness, that's really him." The arrogant officer froze, his face paling. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His earlier confidence crumbled as the truth sank in. He stepped back involuntarily, as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The younger officers immediately straightened, their posture respectful. One of them took a step forward and spoke in a voice filled with genuine reverence. "Your Honor," he said, his words carrying across the scene. We didn't realize. Please forgive this situation." The crowd erupted into chatter, the energy completely transformed. The videos kept rolling. now capturing the dramatic shift in tone. The elderly man stood tall, not gloating, not angry, but steady as always. His calmness now seemed even more powerful, for it revealed the sharp contrast between who he truly was and how he had been treated. The first officer stammered, struggling to form words. I didn't know. The judge lifted a hand gently, silencing him without a raised voice. What matters, he said, his tone still calm, is not whether you knew. What matters is how you chose to treat a man you thought was powerless. Those words struck harder than any punishment could. The officer's face burned with shame as the crowd murmured in agreement. The younger officers lowered their heads slightly, humbled by the truth of the moment. The atmosphere shifted completely. What had started as humiliation for the elderly man was now humiliation for the officer who had abused his authority. And yet the judge never raised his voice, never insulted, never threatened. His authority came not from anger but from truth. The people watching knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. The power of dignity had revealed itself in the most unexpected way, and though the night was not over, everyone sensed that the turning point had finally arrived. The road was silent for a moment after the elderly man revealed his true identity. The flashing lights from the patrol cars still painted the scene in red and blue, but the energy had shifted. What had been a display of arrogance by one officer was now a moment of truth that carried the weight of history. The crowd that had gathered was no longer whispering. They were wide-eyed, stunned by the realization that they were standing only a few feet away from a Supreme Court judge. The younger officers reacted first. Their posture changed instantly, their tone respectful. One stepped forward, bowing his head slightly. Your Honor, he said carefully, we didn't realize. Please forgive the way this stop has unfolded. His voice trembled slightly, not out of fear of punishment but out of reverence. He understood the gravity of being in the presence of someone who had shaped the very laws they were sworn to uphold. The arrogant officer, the one who had initiated the stop, stood frozen. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. A moment earlier, he had been barking orders, filled with confidence. Now he was pale, his face a mixture of shock, fear, and shame. His eyes darted from the judge to the crowd, then back to the judge. The authority he thought he had was gone, stripped away by the simple truth of the man's identity. The judge looked at him calmly. He did not smirk, nor did he gloat. His expression carried no anger, only the same quiet dignity that had defined him throughout the encounter. His voice was steady as he spoke, each word carrying weight. Officer, he said, authority is not a weapon. It is a responsibility. Tonight you chose to use it as a tool of humiliation rather than service. The words cut through the night air. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement. The younger officers lowered their heads, embarrassed to be standing alongside a man whose behavior had dishonored their badge. The arrogant officer swallowed hard, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. The judge continued. When you stopped me, you did not see a man. You saw only your assumptions. You saw only the color of my skin, the car I drove, and the neighborhood on my license. But what you failed to see was my humanity. That is the danger of unchecked pride. That is the failure of forgetting that every citizen deserves dignity. Phones in the crowd recorded every word. The videos would soon spread. But in that moment, those present felt the power of the truth settling deep into their hearts. The judge did not need to raise his voice. His calmness carried more strength than any shout could have. The arrogant officer finally stammered. I didn't know, sir. I didn't know who you were. His voice was small now, a stark contrast to the arrogance he had displayed earlier. The judge turned his gaze toward him, his eyes firm yet compassionate. That is the point. You should not need to know who a person is to treat them with respect. The uniform you wear is a symbol of service to every citizen, regardless of their status. Whether I am a Supreme Court justice or a simple worker, your duty remains the same. Gasps rose from the crowd, followed by nods of approval. The words echoed the very principles that the justice had defended all his life: fairness, equality, and respect under the law. The younger officers shifted uncomfortably, understanding that they had just received a lesson they would never forget. The arrogant officer lowered his head, shame overwhelming him. He muttered an apology, but it was barely audible. The judge did not press him further. Instead, he looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of ordinary people who had stopped to witness the scene. He spoke again, this time not just to the officer but to everyone present. Justice, he said, his voice resonating through the silence, is not confined to courtrooms. It is not limited to grand speeches or legal documents. Justice lives here on the streets in the way we treat one another, in the choices we make when no one is watching or when everyone is. Tonight you all have seen the difference between power used to protect and power used to demean. Remember this moment. The crowd was silent, hanging onto every word. Some felt chills as they realized they were witnessing not just an ordinary confrontation, but a lesson that would spread far beyond that roadside. One of the younger officers, his voice filled with remorse, stepped forward. "Your Honor, please allow me to apologize on behalf of the department. This is not how we are meant to serve." The judge nodded slightly, his expression softening. An apology is the beginning, not the end. What matters is what you choose to do after tonight. Will you remember this moment? Will you let it guide the way you serve your community? That will determine whether this lesson takes root. The younger officer bowed his head respectfully. "Yes, sir. I will remember." The judge turned back to the arrogant officer who still stood stiffly, shame written all over his face. "Do not think this night will vanish from memory," the judge said gently but firmly. "Every action has consequences. What you did cannot be undone, but it can be corrected. You can learn, or you can refuse to change and carry the weight of this shame forever. The choice will be yours." The officer's lips trembled as he whispered, I understand." The judge gave a small nod, then stepped back toward his car. The crowd, moved by what they had witnessed, parted slightly, as though creating space for him to pass with honor. He stood beside his vehicle, his posture tall and unshaken, a living symbol of grace under pressure. The silence broke as people began clapping softly. It was not the loud applause of a stadium, but the quiet, heartfelt recognition of a man who had turned humiliation into a moment of truth. The clapping grew louder as more joined in, the sound filling the night. The officer who had acted with arrogance could not meet anyone's eyes, while the younger officers stood stiffly, humbled by the lesson they had received. The judge raised his hand slightly, signaling for the crowd to calm. "Let us not turn this into a spectacle," he said. "The lesson is enough." Gradually the applause faded, replaced once more by silence. The crowd knew they would never forget this night. The videos on their phones would be shared with millions, but even without the recordings, the memory of his words and his calm strength would remain. The judge opened his car door slowly, his movements measured, as though reminding everyone that dignity should never be rushed. Before stepping inside, he looked once more at the officers. His eyes rested on each of them, especially the one who had begun the humiliation. "Remember," he said, "justice begins with the smallest actions. Do not forget." With that, he entered his car, the quiet closing of the door echoing louder than any shout could have. The engine started smoothly, and as the car pulled away from the flashing lights, the crowd remained still, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. The night had changed. The road would carry the memory of this lesson long after the lights were gone. The judge's car moved slowly away from the flashing red and blue lights. For the first few minutes, the road ahead felt strangely quiet. The night air pressed against the windows and the hum of the engine was steady, almost comforting. Inside the car, the elderly man sat upright, his hands steady on the wheel. Yet his mind was full, replaying the events of the last hour. He had faced humiliation in front of strangers, not because of who he was, but because of what someone assumed him to be. Still, he did not feel bitterness. He felt sadness for the officer, for the system, and for the countless people who endured such treatment every day without anyone ever realizing who they were. His heart ached at the thought that if he had not been who he was, the night might have ended differently. That reality weighed heavily on him. When he finally arrived home, the clock showed it was late. The lights inside his house were still on. His daughter had been waiting, worried by how long it had taken for him to get back. As soon as she saw him step through the door, she rushed forward. "Dad, are you all right? I called you twice, but you didn't answer." He smiled gently, putting his hand on her shoulder. "I'm fine, my dear. Just a delay on the road." She studied his face carefully. She could tell something had happened, but she also knew her father well. If he wasn't ready to share the full story tonight, she would wait. He had always taught her patience the same way he lived his life, with calmness no matter the storm. Later that night, the judge sat in his study, surrounded by shelves filled with books of law and history. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the familiar words etched on the spines. So many of those books represented the principles he had dedicated his life to protecting: justice, fairness, equality. And yet, earlier that evening, those very principles had been absent from the way he was treated. As he thought, his phone buzzed. A message had arrived from a colleague in Washington. "Are you all right? I just saw the video. It's everywhere." He sighed softly. The video from the bystanders had already spread. He had known it would, but he had hoped for a little more time before it reached the public eye. Still, he wasn't surprised. This was not just his story anymore. It belonged to everyone who had watched and felt the sting of injustice in their own way. By morning, the video was on every news channel. Headlines flashed: "Supreme Court Justice Stopped and Humiliated by Officer." Talk shows replayed the clip of the moment he revealed who he was, the crowd gasping, the officer shrinking back in shame. Millions of people watched, and millions had opinions. Some were outraged, demanding reform. Others reflected quietly, realizing that if such a man could be treated that way, then ordinary people faced far worse without recognition. The judge did not seek fame or attention. In fact, he avoided interviews at first. He believed the story was not about him, but about something larger, about respect, about service, about the way authority was used. Still, he could not ignore the responsibility the moment had placed upon him. 1 week later, he stood in front of a large audience at a law school, invited to give a lecture that had been scheduled months earlier. The room was filled with students, professors, and community leaders, but now every eye carried even more focus, waiting to hear his words in the wake of what had happened. He stood at the podium, his silver hair shining under the lights, his presence commanding without effort. When he began to speak, his voice was steady and calm, the same voice that had cut through the tension on that highway. "Many of you have seen the events of last week," he began. "Yes, I was stopped. Yes, I was treated without dignity. But this is not about me. This is about the values that hold our society together. Justice is not a robe. Justice is not a title. Justice is how we choose to treat each other every single day." The room was silent, absorbing his words. "When that officer looked at me," he continued, "he did not see a man who had given his life to service. He saw only what his assumptions allowed him to see. But the truth is this: every person you meet carries a story you do not know. Every person you meet carries worth that does not depend on what they wear, what they drive, or where they live." He paused, letting the words sink in. Students shifted in their seats, deeply moved. "I did not reveal who I was to seek revenge," the judge said. "I revealed who I was to remind everyone, officers, citizens, leaders, and students like you, that respect should not depend on recognition. It should not depend on status. It should be given freely, because without it, we lose the very foundation of our justice." Applause filled the room, rising and falling like waves. Yet the judge did not smile in triumph. Instead, he nodded quietly, acknowledging that the work was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the incident became a turning point in the city. The police department launched new training programs focusing on respect, communication, and humility. The younger officers who had recognized the judge carried the memory of that night with them into every stop they made. And the arrogant officer, now disciplined, was left with a choice: to remain bitter or to change. Time would reveal his path, but the lesson had already been delivered. For the judge, life returned to a rhythm of hearings, decisions, and family dinners. Yet something about him had changed. He had always believed in the power of law, but now he spoke even more about the power of everyday choices, the small acts of dignity that shaped lives just as much as court rulings did. One evening, as he sat with his grandchildren, they asked him about the video they had seen on television. "Grandpa," one of them said, "were you scared that night?" He smiled softly, pulling the child close. "No, my dear. I was not scared. I was sad. Sad that some people forget what respect means. But I was also hopeful, because even in the darkest moments there is always a chance to remind others of what is right." The children listened quietly, their young minds absorbing the wisdom in his words. To them, he was not just a judge. He was a grandfather who taught them by example even when it was difficult. As the night grew quiet again, the judge reflected on the journey of his life. He had faced challenges, victories, and losses. But that night on the roadside reminded him of something important. Dignity was not about titles or honors. It was about holding steady when others tried to strip it away. It was about showing strength without anger, truth without cruelty, and power without arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, looking out the window at the stars above. The world still had much to learn, but he believed change was possible. One lesson, one moment, one act of respect at a time. And as long as he had breath, he would continue to remind people of that truth. The story of that night was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who saw themselves in his calmness, in his silence, and in his words. It was a story that would echo for years to come, reminding people that true power is not in control but in respect. And with that thought, the judge closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in peace. The lesson had been given. The rest was up to the world.